on general government.
Yep.
My name is Representative Camille Vela-Wilkinson, and I am the chairman for the subcommittee. Would the clerk kindly call the roll?
Chairwoman Vela-Wilkinson.
Here.
Representative Amore. Representative Baginski. Representative Marzikowski.
Present.
Representative Nadon. Representative Rogerio. Representative O'Brien.
Here.
And Representative Diaz.
I'm here.
Okay, we have a quorum.
Clerk, did you notice that Representative Gregor Moore is online?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so he's
Thank you.
attending too. All right, thank you very much. We're going to have hearings on the Department of Administration and the Department of Revenue. So Sharon, whenever you're ready to begin, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. As usual, we will take you through some information to orient you to the budgets for your consideration before you, as well as pointing out some differences and changes from prior years, any items of interest, and then in the case of these departments, some specific items relative to COVID response, and anywhere we've covered items already as part of articles. We will repeat that information, but just really quickly move through that. So a bunch of this is here for your reference, so I will try and move quickly, but certainly stop me if you need to as I go. So beginning with the Department of Administration, this is a department with a number of really overhead and centralized state functions, from human services to legal to capital asset management and maintenance. This is also where some centralized things are budgeted, such as the state's debt service. In the overhead function, you have just the sort of back office functions of state government, like accounts and control, and the Office of Management and Budget. There are also some specialty programs, energy resources, library, state planning, health source RI, and a couple of divisions that deal with personnel and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Opportunity. So it's a wide-ranging department with a variety of functions. Looking at the total funding for this department, you can see that the enacted budget included a total of $623 million, with a little less than half of that coming from general revenues. The governor's revised budget for this current year is $88 million more, with a lot of shifts among fund sources and a net addition of federal funds. The FY 2022 governor's budget is $500 million, with about half again coming from general revenues, and the changes amongst fund sources are shown there. Just a quick visual, as I mentioned, there's a lot of COVID response money in this department. So if you strip out that and look at what are some of the traditional activities of the department and the fund sources, the funding that supports them, you can see those shown in that section of the pie. And the COVID money goes down as we move out of 21 and into 22. So a lot of this movement makes comparisons to the enacted budget a little bit difficult, so we'll try and point out these anomalies as we go. Some of the big general revenue components of the state's COVID-19 funding are shown here. There was $16.2 million included in the enacted budget. You recall at the time in December, it was not clear the state would be able to access certain federal funds after the close of the calendar year. That has since changed, and some of that represents why you see some fund shifts and some reductions in the use of general revenues. We'll talk about those as we go. Across some other kind of different ways to group items, you can see here debt service, as I mentioned, it's almost to $200 million of the $600 million in the enacted. That doesn't change particularly much in the current year, but it does go down in fiscal 22. Health source RI, fairly a stable number, 20 million, 22 million, 25 million. That number's been very similar for the past several years. There's some statewide money budgeted as well, and this is where you get some items that affect the whole state, and we'll talk about those. And we'll keep going through this by category of expenditure because debt service represents such a huge component of this budget. And this is the debt for all projects except for higher ed and some of DOT. So everything going on in the rest of the state, the payments for that show up in this budget. In terms of staffing, gross salaries for DOA, $55 million. The total recommended FTE, almost 650 FTE. Currently filled 614. Because, as you know, there's always turnover assumed in most of the budgets. That means that some positions are always vacant, or they're intermittently vacant as positions are vacated and refilled. So there's always a percent of turnover savings. This budget assumes about 3.4%, a little bit less than the statewide average. Represents about 22 positions always being vacant at any given time. And about 14 positions are funded in 22 that are not currently filled now, just to give you some perspective on the level of vacancies occurring. In terms of FTEs for fiscal 22, the recommendation includes 2 additional FTEs, 1 for the Office of Risk Management and 1 for Human Resources. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but there's a major component of the department's work that is that's in a category called internal service programs, and these are essentially operations that are billed to other state entities. So they work a little bit like a business. They don't show up in the budget appropriations for this department. They show up in the billings to other agencies, and we'll talk about that more as we go. The rest of the programs have about 230 staff assigned to them. Looking at the changes from the enacted budget, we'll start with kind of the big item, and that is the COVID response, and then the other items are listed here, and we'll refer back to this reference slide as we go. Under the COVID items, the governor's budget has $382 million in the categories listed here, the major spending items, and then includes another $142 million for the fiscal 22 budget. Obviously, nothing was included in the enacted for that, a total of $523.7 million. And we'll talk about some of these items. Some of them represent, just a refresher for you, such as the Hospital Assistance Program. That was $125 million in the current year. It's essentially, it was spent, and the first phase of that was actually spent in fiscal 20. It's for a total support from the state of $220.5 million for hospitals. There's also money showing up in both DOA and DOR on small business support. So $87.4 million for Restore RI, and that's a small business grant program ran out of Commerce. You also heard a lot about the $200 million rental and utilities assistance program authorized as part of the late December stimulus package. That money is showing up in DOA's budget, piece of it in the current year, and then a piece in 22. This we've talked about a few times, so this is being operated by Rhode Island Housing. They are currently taking applications and issuing funds for that program. Another kind of change is just the movement of the $23 million you authorized for higher education from higher ed to DOA. It's more of an accounting issue. There's no change to the enacted budget. It's just where it's showing up in the budget. The surge, that was the operations of the alternative hospital sites, 3 locations, 1,000 beds, and the deconstruction of that. Budget is about $68 million each of the next 2 years. This is a total of about $15 million more than originally thought, and there's still $8.2 million of general revenues budgeted. You had originally budgeted some, as I mentioned, because the CRF money was running out and FEMA needed a state match. With the extension of the FEMA match, that freed up the CRF money, and the the state was able to relieve itself of some of the general revenue expenses that had been budgeted. There's still funding for some contracts with Kent and Rhode Island hospitals, not covered by the CDC grants, and the CRF, which at the time were fully allocated, and these are not eligible FEMA expenses. So that's why you still see state general revenues, and to the extent federal funds become available or not is used to the extent that they were budgeted, this is an opportunity to save general revenues here if additional funds, if they're underutilized in other programs. There's also a section of spending on government readiness, which is a wide range of expenditures, including information technology projects, cleaning, screening, different ways of receiving customers, lobbying, cubicle reconfiguration. The 21 budget includes $31.2 million. Then it also has $5.5 million set aside for fiscal 22. Overall, this is about $3 million more than enacted. There is still some general revenues funded, and the money shows up in a number of state agencies, which we've summarized here for you. Most of it is in DOA, which is why we're talking about it here. As I mentioned, there's information technology projects. This is where other expenses are kind of being grouped in terms of things that kind of a catch-all for government spending outside of direct public health response, like the cost for some short-term borrowing when the state had to run a line of credit last March, and other things like that. As I mentioned, the 22 budget has federal funds, but the source is not identified. I also mentioned this to you in your budget overview back in March, and this is essentially unidentified federal sources that would likely either require American Rescue Plan funds or underutilized other federal funds as we get a little better of idea of how much that's been budgeted is actually needed. And to that end, we're going to show you some of the CRF, some of the COVID money budgeted in DOA that was recommended and how much has been spent. And you can see, with the exception of the housing, rental, and utility program, most of the money has been spent, and it even looks, with the exception of that and the government readiness. However, if you look at the surge, it looks like more has been spent than was budgeted. But then if I flip over to the slide we showed you during the DOH presentation, you can see the surge money budgeted there is underspent. So this is more a function of where this expense appears to be showing up. And it underscores the need to revisit some of these expenses and make sure we have a good handle on where the spending is occurring, what that means for availability of other flexible funds for other budget needs, either to replace some of the general revenues that were budgeted for these expenses, and to just have a good idea of where the spending is happening. It has certainly been a moving target. So moving on to items sort of grouped in a category of statewide, and that includes the repayment of the state's use of the rainy day fund. You remember that the 2020 budget needed $120 million to close the deficit, and the repayment of that was scheduled to occur over this year and next year in the budget you adopted in December. So as you recall, the governor's budget delays that further another year and essentially spreads the money out over 3 years, freeing up $82 million to use in the current year for more and to allow for a major surplus to accrue to fiscal 22. So again, this is, these are some of the items that would be affected if there's freed up federal funds elsewhere. Another item of statewide interest is that the recommended budget sets aside $4.3 million from general revenues in the event an agreement is reached with the Laborers International Union of North America over a dispute regarding how certain longevity and overtime payments were calculated, and the methodology used for that, and certain contributions to a pension fund. So this money has been set aside. It is not based on any particular calculation. I think it's the budget was cautiously arriving at some number that may be owed. I'm sure they may be able to give you an update in their presentation. The only thing I will note is, should a settlement be reached, this is a one-time expense. However, to the extent it affects longer-term things like whether the base pays are correct, that is not accounted for in the budget. The other item you've been hearing about during recent budget hearings is the effects of the voluntary retirement incentive. If you recall, this is the same as the program, essentially the same as the program adopted back in 2018, where the state offered incentives to have those who are already eligible to retire leave by a certain date, and assume that there will be some long-term savings from refilling the positions at a lower cost with people who do not have a longevity bonus. And so there's net savings over the 2 years of $6 million. That's calculated as $8.2 million in general revenue savings, offset by the payouts and the need to adjust for that throughout all the state agencies. So this money is budgeted centrally here in DOA, as often the case, but would need to be spread to the other departments who actually have the savings. Moving on to debt service costs, as I mentioned, the administration budget does include most debt service costs, and except for some DOT and all higher ed. How does that break out? About half of it's for GO bonds, and the half that isn't for GO bonds is split among other obligations, such as paying the debt associated with historic tax credits, convention center, COPS, and other debt. Speaking of the convention center, when the authority runs an operating deficit, the state is responsible for covering the shortfall. They manage the operations of the convention center, the Dunkin' Donuts Center, the Veterans Auditorium, the Garrahy Courthouse Garage. The governor recommends about $23 million in both fiscal year 22 and 21 and 22, which is roughly the enacted level. One item of note is the Garrahy Garage project. That has occurred since 2014, when the Convention Center Authority was authorized to issue up to $45 million to construct a garage, and the 2016 Assembly amended the authorization for borrowing to occur if the authority has 3 purchase and sale agreements or Wexford agrees to no less than 400 spaces. Those bonds were issued in March 2018, and construction started in June 2018, and the garage opened in March of 2020. The authority is in the process of refinancing this debt, and it's expected to have $8 million of its savings that would be achieved in FY 2021 and FY 2022. It looks like about $4 million of that will be used for Garrahy project cost overruns. Those costs would be incurred, the savings would be achieved in 21 and 22, but the costs would then be incurred from 23 to 26. The governor includes $1.7 million for debt service, and this assumes $1.3 million in revenues would lower the state's debt service obligation. There is no state support budgeted beyond fiscal 23. Just to kind of wrap up a discussion we've been having for a number of years, the job creation guarantee, the $75 million issued for 38 studios, where the state found itself repaying the debt service. That has been completely repaid now as of fiscal 21. And you can see here that the net payments were $35.8 million. The certificates of participation, which is another area of debt service payments, deal with a number of capital projects. And here we're just kind of showing you the payments that are made annually, and then the last payment date for each one of these pieces of debt. Moving on to a couple of other programs, library aid, helping state aid for public libraries and administering federal funding for libraries. Areas of support include the children's and adult services, literacy, and continuing education library communities. Governor recommends the enacted amount of $9.6 million for library aid, while the law does provide up to a 25% reimbursement of prior year expenses. This is the same as the prior year, but it is $1.3 million less than it would be allowed under current law. Library construction aid, $2.1 million. That's $0.6 million less than the enacted amount, and it is based on what the state believes it's going to have to pay. So this is kind of like school construction. If you know you have the expense, this is the budget. It's done on a reimbursement basis. The next item deals with Health Source RI. As you know, this is the state's exchange, and it's funded primarily from a health premium assessment adopted back in 2015. These are the expenses shown here. The budget includes 12 FTEs in the enacted, 14 in the governor's budget. You may remember that the Assembly authorized the imposition of a shared responsibility payment to assist with a reinsurance program for health insurers. The recommended budget includes $14 million, assuming $9 million of that comes from the penalty payment, and federal funds are $5 million. And this helps payments to health insurance carriers and to keep the premiums low across the board. The recommendation assumes about $7.6 million for fiscal 21 receipts from the normal assessment and $8 million for 2022. This was based on projected enrollments in the individual market of about 33,000. Right now, it's looking like they're about 31,000. So it's possible that that assessment estimate is a bit high. The next area is energy resources, and we'll remind you, we've shown this in a couple of departments where the state was awarded $18 million in a Volkswagen settlement, and most of that went through the AG or to DEM. Some of the money that went to DEM was actually allocated to energy resources. The office also runs the longstanding regional greenhouse gas initiatives. And then a couple of other areas in DOA's budget worth noting. They house the Division of Statewide Planning, and that includes transportation planning funds. They provide guidance for staff in coordinating planning activities and the state guide plan. Office of Management and Budget, that is the Budget Office, Performance Management, Regulatory Reform, and Internal Audit, those separate divisions there. You may remember a few years ago, the internal audit was established within the Office of Management and Budget. They do the efficiency evaluations of operations. Then there's the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Opportunity. They do work with the Minority Business Enterprise Compliance, Outreach and Diversity, state having to do with the State Purchasing Act, Minority Business Enterprise. And then because one of the big operations is capital projects, there is quite a bit of the state's capital projects housed in the Department of Administration. Total cost $646 million, with $340 of that expected to be used from fiscal 22 to fiscal 26. We divide those projects into those that are occurring on the Pastore campus, those that are occurring at other state facilities, and then kind of a grouping of other projects the state is responsible for. On the Pastore campus, primarily it's asset protection type projects, roofs, windows, utilities, and in some cases just demolishing buildings. Other state facilities projects, the Capitol Hill Center, the Convention Center, Dunkin' Donuts Center, Shepherd Building, and then anything to do with Eleanor Slater Hospital is now housed under DOA. As you know, the governor has a proposal to issue some new debt relative to the Eleanor Slater Hospital reorganization. That hearing on that project has not been scheduled yet, so that will be scheduled for a future date. The actual spend is included in the Department of Administration's budget because the Division of Capital Projects is the one running that. Similarly, we talked in the Health Department's budget about the State Medical Examiner's facility. It's technically included in DOA's budget. Then there are other projects, including environmental compliance, statewide facility master plan, and energy efficiency work. One item we talked about before, and we'll talk about again, is the enterprise system modernization. There have been audit findings that suggest that the state has major technology deficiencies, and the state does have an IT investment fund. It doesn't have a great deal of money in it, and much of it has been budgeted for expenditure. And then a couple years ago, the state hired a vendor to look at options for replacing its current systems. And you heard a proposal around this last session, essentially putting the state on a cloud-based system for its business operations. The capital budget assumes that this project would go before next year's assembly to approve some new debt. So the exact proposal is not before you today. It's in the long-term capital budget. You had a hearing on this, essentially this project last year. That is to cover human resources, payroll, finance, and it would take multiple years to implement. And then a word about the internal service funds. As I mentioned earlier, the state uses internal service funds to reimburse one agency for services provided to another. So we only kind of show it in the budget once, in the Appropriations Act once. We kind of show you where it's happening and then budget the spend in each individual agency. This was greatly expanded in 2017, and DOA is required to report the fund's activities. We've reported to you a number of times that there are some concerns about trying to get this right and getting the funds budgeted in the right years and the amounts assigned to the right things. Here's an example of the different programs that are run as internal service funds. Many of them have been run that way for a while, the newest ones being human resources, facilities, and information technology. In terms of staff on these positions, there were 395 filled early April, and so there's a number of vacancies compared to the governor's budget proposal. One item that's treated as an internal service fund is what we call the Assessed Fringe Benefit Fund. So the state makes an assessment against the budgets of every agency employing people and pools that money in order to make payouts for unemployment, unused leave when someone retires or separates from service, workers' compensation. This allows the state to maximize fund sources from all items rather than to have a state agency bear the full cost each time a worker leaves service, and this has been a long time established. But this is also the area where the assessment is being increased to cover the payouts related to the voluntary retirement assessment. So all agencies are kicking in a little more, and then the savings are expected to exceed that. Agencies get human resources services, and then they're essentially charged in each agency based on the number of filled FTEs they had. Facilities management is responsible for 140 state buildings, and so the way they build the agencies is on their square footage occupancy. So that's utilities, janitorial, et cetera. And then IT services are provided and then billed based on what kind of services are delivered. And then other items such as fleet, mailroom, phones, et cetera. So all in, these big centralized items are in the agency budgets, but DOA itself is a customer of these as well, and so it has to budget $14 million for its own centralized services, and the governor's budget includes all of that plus some undistributed money in order to work out where, as I mentioned before, the budgets are not exactly lined up, so there's some undistributed expenses showing here that should be in other places. And then big picture, the spend across these three centralized services in the enacted budget, $106.6 million budgeted, but the agency budgets are only showing $93 million of expenditures. So there ends up being a disconnect, and this is what I've been talking about. Now, actual spends may end up being lower, and so the gap is not that big, but each year you have to readjust your billing if you're running a deficit, and in this case it seems like more funding is budgeted in the agency doing the work than the one being billed, so there's a gap there. And so that completes the review of the Department of Administration, and I'm happy to answer questions on that or move right through Department of Revenue.
Does anyone from the committee have a question of Sharon right now? You can move on, Sharon. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. DOR was actually created primarily out of previous divisions of the Department of Administration: Lottery, Municipal Finance, Taxation, the Registry of Motor Vehicles, State Aid, and then newly established the Collections Unit. This is a $700 million budget with a lot of that money coming from the lottery. So when you exclude the lottery, it's quite a bit smaller. Looking at it by program, you can see that the lottery accounts for over half of all of the funding discussed here, and a number of smaller offices, and then the bigger divisions of taxation, municipal finance, and then the bulk of state aid flows through this division. The only piece that doesn't is the library aid we just talked about in DOA, and of course school aid, which runs through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. In terms of centralized service expenses assigned to DOR, you can see that the governor's budget has $5.4 million, most of which would come from state general revenues. We have this here just to point out that it looks like the budget includes a little bit less than the department has been spending, and so it's not clear if this is sufficient for the expenses they'll be billed. As I mentioned with DOA, there are also some COVID business supports flowing through DOR. The November pause had some new grants issued, and this went through the Division of Taxation. So that funding, which we originally budgeted as part of the Executive Office of Commerce, has been properly moved into the Department of Revenue, where the spending actually occurred. So this isn't a new program or new money, it's just a shift from one department to another. On the staffing front, the biggest change here is one you already had a hearing about, and that is the transfer of 35 positions from the Division of Taxation to the Department of Labor and Training. 4 positions are also added to taxation related to the adult use marijuana program, and 3 positions for the CDL road testing. So you've actually had hearings on all 3 of those items, but we leave that there for your reference. Additionally, you had a hearing on the license plate reissuance delay, which is one of the major changes in the budget, and then the inclusion of restricted receipts related to the Pawtucket TIF project is also shown here. So those are kind of the big changes. By category, a big chunk of the budget is aid, as I mentioned, and another big chunk really is related to the lottery operating expenses. If you exclude the lottery, 3/4 of the budget is aid, and the other big chunk is for staffing. And speaking of staffing, the enacted budget has 602.5 filled authorized positions, and as of April 10th, 527 of them are filled. When you move to the 22, the governor has proposed 574, which is the net result of the minus 35 and then the adds for those other 3 items. If you compare the filled, once you back out that 35 from the transfer to the governor's budget, you'll see that that 495 of the equivalent 22 positions are filled, but 542 of them are funded. So there's quite a big number that is funded but not filled. In fact, almost 48 positions. And we'll show you as we go a couple of the places where the big vacancies are occurring. I mean, as we showed you at DOA, there's always some level of turnover, either forced or natural, happening. FTE distribution by division shown here. You can see that taxation and DMV have the bulk of the staff, and also account for most of the agencies. Right now, there's about 28 vacancies at Division of Taxation and almost 30 at the DMV. A number of smaller entities within the department are essentially level funded current service budgets, but we'll note them here for you so as not to exclude them. The director's office, one thing we like to point out in some of these presentations is reporting requirements and whether or not the department is in compliance. This is actually something that has to be reported as part of the budget, so we are reporting that to you. The director's office has a couple of reports due that it is in compliance with. Revenue analysis has a number of reports it needs to do, and while it ran behind on some of the evaluation reports, it's running closer than in prior years. Lottery division, you've heard a lot about the lottery over the past couple of years. Here's a kind of breakout of where that $400 million shows up in the budget, because everything does flow through the budget. You've got a $400 million of essentially prizes and payments flowing through the budget. But in terms of staff and operations, that's about $25 million of the total. There is a reduction in the lottery budget that's noteworthy, and essentially it is a reduction of about $400,000 for outreach and expenses, and it's linked to a proposal to assume more revenues from the lottery transfer. I would note that the lottery transfer is actually estimated twice a year at the Revenue Estimating Conference. This adjustment here, it's not clear that it would it would increase the transfer because it looks like the recommended spending is actually above historical spending levels, and typically when we estimate, we account for that. And the rest of the budget is just current service staffing and operations. Moving on to Division of Taxation, some of our budget accounts provide us with some detail expenditures, and we've separated the FTEs into these budget accounts. They may not necessarily be the divisions that taxation refers to, but this is one way we're able to track it. But we're also kind of showing you where some of the vacancies are based on that information. So you can see the 252 FTEs with 219 filled right now. And then, as I mentioned, most of the changes here we've already covered in prior hearings. It's the transfers, it's the new marijuana proposal, and that's essentially it. That these items are summarized here for you. And if we move on to some other things we've tried to bring to you, and that's relevant audit findings. As we mentioned in the administration's budget, there was an audit finding on IT in the Division of Taxation. There was an audit finding over tax collections, and a recommendation that there be functions more integrated with their STARS system, and that is the response to the audit was that is anticipated to be completed by June of 22. We'll also note that in mid-April, the governor requested an amendment to add an additional FTE to taxation, as we had discussed during the Article 15 hearing. It was originally intended to provide some staff support for the right share proposal that had been inadvertently omitted from the budget. And then the next couple slides just show you what we showed you already on the employer tax unit, so that's there for your reference. Same on the marijuana proposal, Article 11, and where the other regulatory expenses are. And then moving on to the Division of Motor Vehicles. This division is well known to many, 211.5 authorized FTEs. I'll take a moment to note the branch offices here. Some of you have been interested in the Westerly office. That lease was not renewed at the town hall. They're in the process of relocating. Apparently also the lease was unexpectedly not renewed in the Warren location. I'm sure they're prepared to discuss this with you. We would simply note that this is one of the locations that's required to be open according to the general laws. The general laws do identify a couple of areas that are required to have branch offices. The governor's overall recommendation includes some funding to restore turnover savings and, of course, current service adjustments, and includes some other corrections. And as you've heard in prior hearings, there's the transfer of the CDL road testing from CCRI to DMV and the delay on the license plate reissuance. One other area of interest over the last few years has been the Real ID program. A few years ago, the Assembly authorized additional staff and funding to staff up in anticipation of pending Real ID deadline that was going to be implemented over a number of years, and the revenues were assumed to offset the expenses. The recommendation reduces this a little bit based on a volume past what was then October 2021 implementation date. Very recently, that deadline was extended again out through May of 2023. So there may be some revisions needed in this area. This just kind of summarizes those expenses over time. Also, the governor includes a new federal CDL grant and devotes a couple of existing positions to this endeavor. And another audit issue had to do with the intermodal surface transportation collections, and the DMV is in the process of remedying that situation, expected at the end of September. I won't belabor the license plate issuance delay issue here. You could probably recite it to me, but that is back in the budget. And then again, the CDL testing transfer. So then we can move on to the collections unit. This was a newly authorized entity for a limited period of time, 8 positions, expecting to collect debts that were known to be owed to other agencies, intended to be more expansive than the previously only available tax refund offset program. This was to be ended at the end of this fiscal year. The governor has proposed the article to extend that, so you already had that hearing as well. And the governor's budget includes $800,000 to support the unit. We did add a little bit of updated information from the article hearing, and that is there was testimony at the May Revenue Conference suggesting collections at about $1.7 million. Not all of that stays with the state because some of that money is due to federal and other sources. So that number is somewhat smaller, with the bulk of it coming from traffic tribunal receivables. And then as we move to the state aid program, as I mentioned, that's a significant portion of this budget, and it runs through a couple of major programs and a couple of smaller items. Distressed communities, pilot, motor vehicle phase out. And we've had to account for some of the enhancements done in the fiscal 21 budget just to kind of complete the spend picture. Distressed communities is funded at a prior regular funding level of $12.4 million, pilot at 46.1, and the motor vehicle phase out, consistent with current law, funds the next increment on the phase out. The value of that increment is about $29 million. And then also the state provides a reimbursement to municipalities on certain property revaluations, and the governor's budget funds the estimate for this. Essentially, they do need to reimburse the cost. This estimate is at 1.1 and 1.5 million for 21 and 22 respectively. And that wraps up Department of Revenue. I'm happy to try and answer any questions and have the staff here to help as well.
Thank you, Sharon. Do we have any questions from the committee? Sharon, one thing that I was curious about, and I have a bunch of questions for the staff, but one question I had has to do with the state redistricting project. What department does that come out of in terms of funding? Do you know?
I believe the legislature.
Okay.
I don't know that there's additional redistricting in other budgets, not that I'm aware of, but
All right.
I'm happy to make sure I'm right about that.
All right, thank you, because I know the project is supposed to start sometime this summer, I believe, once they get the rest of the data from the census.
Yes, I know in the past the Assembly's had some expense to that. I just don't know if they're the only entity that has an expense.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. All right. Representative Nadon, did you have any questions for the divisions? Okay. Well, I tell you what, I'm going to begin, and feel free to stop me when you have. Okay. Starting with the Department of Administration, I know that last year there was a conversation with regards to a significant number of vacancies for recruiters in HR, and I'm wondering if you're still having a problem with recruiting for human resources for the state.
Good evening, Chairwoman Vela-Wilkinson, and members of the Finance Subcommittee. This is my first time in front of the subcommittee, and I can say it's always a pleasure to be with members of the House. And thank you, Sharon, for presenting on the department's budget, Department of Administration, as well as the Department of Revenue, since I was around for a lot of the Department of Revenue stuff while it was being put together. But before we get into addressing your questions, I'd like to take a moment to thank our dedicated public servants who worked so hard to keep us safe during the pandemic. The vaccine team announced yesterday the 1 millionth dose was administered, and that we have already started vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds. And there are hopeful signs that we are on our way to a rebound to a more normal way of life. I also want to thank members of the House for your thoughtful engagement in addressing the hardships that Rhode Island has faced over the past year. It's been anything but normal, but we certainly value your input. And my colleagues with me tonight, Joe Cadega, Dali Pascali, and BJ Kumar, are here to answer your questions. They're not strangers to the House, and we look forward to remaining a resource for you and staff, not just emerging from the hardships of COVID, but for passing the FY22 budget. DOA has a mission of managing the state's financial, human, and other resources in support of other state agencies carrying out their responsibilities to provide the citizens of the state of Rhode Island with the most responsive and most cost-effective services possible. We strive to deliver the best value of taxpayer dollars to our citizens. We're constantly looking at how to improve processes, increase the value of our work for the agencies that supply direct critical resources to the residents of Rhode Island. Our department provides so many services to other agencies through budgeting, technology, planning, procurement, HR, etc. Sharon covered them all. DOA has played a central role in delivering these services in addition to COVID response efforts, and I'm proud of our efforts. I've also learned in the first 2 months on this job that there are areas in which we can improve. We're investing in these areas and plan to, such as technology, for example, and won't just improve efficiencies for today, but will be an investment in our future. And so in terms of your questions, you had posed a question about recruiting and a conversation that was had earlier. I was not part of that conversation, but I am in contact with HR on almost a daily basis. And I can tell you that COVID did slow the recruiting process considerably. And there are, as Sharon noted, quite a few positions that have remained unfilled. But there have been aggressive recruiting efforts, particularly in taxation. It was tax season. But in DOA, we continue to fill positions selectively and have found that the most skilled positions continue to attract the talented people that we need to fill them. For example, Dottie Pascal now heads up the Pandemic Recovery Office. She moved over from Audit, and we're happy to have her there. And that's just one example. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Joe and see if he has anything to add.
Sure, Chairwoman, we can reach out to HR and get back to you about the specific positions that you're asking about. If you could clarify, you're asking about recruitment positions within the division of HR, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. What happened last year was we were talking about the gap of the positions and why there was such a problem filling them. And I don't recall the individual who testified here, but I know that she had said that part of the problem was that they were having difficulty with recruiters in HR. And I had said to her, well, then why wouldn't you just create a hot sheet and try to recruit through DLT if you have a shortfall for recruiters? And I never really got a satisfactory answer or response after the fact. So looking at the presentation that Sharon provided to us, I was concerned once again at looking at the gap in the various departments and divisions in terms of the workforce. And so I wanted to know if you still have a shortage of recruiters so that I could clear up in my own mind how long it could potentially take to fill some of those vacancies.
I do have to say that one strategic goal of the department is to better leverage our existing HR capacity through the ERP. Right now, as you might be aware, our division of HR, much of their work is focused on administration and processing using antiquated systems, carbon copy paper, microfiche, and they're bogged down with much of the administrative burden of maintaining our personnel systems. In the governor's budget, in the capital plan for next year, includes beginning of a major upgrade to state technology resources, and that's the enterprise resource planning system. And part of the goal of that is by freeing up the division of HR's capacity to work on strategic activities like recruiting, outreach, talent management. It will allow us to better leverage the resources we have. So right now, HR is limited. HR is limited by some of our systems. They're focused in their day-to-day on paperwork and processing, and the hope is that in the long term they can pivot to more strategic activities like what you're referencing.
And Mr. Codega, I'm assuming, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that because of the pandemic, it put a huge dent in the state internship program. Am I correct in that assumption?
I don't know specifically about the impact on the state internship program, but I can get back to you on that.
All right, thank you. I'm going to turn now to some of the slides that we had dealing with COVID-19, and I'd like to talk to you about the Renton Utilities Assistance Consolidated Appropriations Act. Who is the appropriate person to direct the question to, please?
Chairwoman, this is Dorothy Pascal. I believe I might be able to assist you with this.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pascal. So I see that that we had $200 million in small state as the minimum, and it says ARP extended use of funds through September of 2022, and it covers rent and utilities assistance up to 12 months. So I was wondering how we're doing outreach to notify people that this is available to them. I see it is operated by Rhode Island Housing, but I'd like to know how we're notifying people.
Correct. There is a consolidated effort with Rhode Island Housing, Department of Human Services LIHEAP program, the Office of Energy Resources, and National Grid. There have been ongoing meetings to make sure we get the message out that there are funds available. It's my understanding that the shut-off notices, the moratorium expires sometime in June, and part of the shut-off notice that National Grid will be mailing out to the consumer will include information about this program and how to get the help out to the people who most need it. If you need more information than that, I'd be happy to circle back and get back to you.
Thank you. I would also like to know if there's any outreach being done for landlords, because certainly they would know whether or not the rent is being paid up by their tenants. And I'd like to make sure that they have the opportunity at least to have a conversation with the tenant to say there is additional state aid that's available to you. I don't have that answer on the landlord piece of it, but I'll be happy to get it to you. Okay, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, also going with COVID-19, we were, I want to talk specifically about the recommendation budgets. And it says 200,000 for salaries and benefits, 3.6 million for contracted services, 600,000 for lease space, and then 900,000 for other expenses. 900,000, nearly $1 million listed under the category of other, is kind of a big salt of block to swallow down. I'd like to have a feeling for what that encompasses, if you know. And if you don't know, I'd like to get that information.
I don't have the information you're asking for, but I'd be happy to try to get it and get it back to you as soon as possible.
So if you look at the slide presentation provided by Sharon, I'm referring to slide 22, just for your information. And yes, I would definitely like to know what falls into the category of other expenses. Thank you. Let's see. Also going under the category of other, under the Department of Administration, and now I'm at slide, Sharon, I tell you, the print is a little small. 25. On slide 25, where it's talking about the governor's, what's enacted as the budget, the revision, all funds and so forth for fiscal year 21 by the governor and fiscal year 22 by the governor. The very last category under other says, again, 3.1 million, and then for fiscal year 21 and for fiscal year 22, 3.2 million. So I'd like to know what is encompassed under the category of other, please. All right. Who would I speak to with regards to library aid, please? Director, no. Is there anyone here that could answer questions with regards to library aid? All right, I'll put those in an email, and then we'll just send it to the appropriate department or division head. Let's see what else. Do we have anyone from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Opportunity with us tonight?
We do not, but there might be a question or two that I can answer for you.
All right. I'd like to talk about the minority business enterprise, and I'd like to know what type of impact the pandemic had on our minority enterprises over the past year, and if they are availing themselves of the assistant grants.
In terms of that, in terms of how it's affected the MBE performance, I'll have to get that in a report to you.
And,
We don't have that compiled just
okay.
now, but
And,
I have been having meetings with the Office of Diversity and Equity very frequently of late.
are we having any progress with regards to the quick pay to the minority subcontractors on any of the state contracts, please?
I don't know the answer to that question.
All right, if you would include that in your report to me, I would appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move to the enterprise system modernization now, please. And so I note on slide, I think that's 66. Yep, on slide 66, where the last bullet point says that maintenance is becoming an issue and that employees familiar with the systems are eligible or will, or will retire. So they're either eligible to retire or they are planning to retire. So I'd like to know what your plan is in order to make sure that we have some type of a turnover, or so that there isn't going to be a gap in services as these people are rotating out of state service.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I will take that. Vijay Kumar, Head of IT for the state. So the ERP strategy, has been published over a year ago, and we have shared it with the House Finance Committee as well. One of the major drivers for modernization of the system is, of course, the staff, which will be retiring in the next few years. So the ERP actually looks at the finance system, which includes payroll, which is an extremely outdated system, and also the HRIS system and the grant system. So to answer your specific question regarding the plan, we have somebody who heads up the Department of Administration who has been with us for over 20 years. He's going to be around definitely for the next few years. And he has a solid team. The individuals who will be retiring, again, some of the technology is legacy technology, including COBOL. And we have a strategy to supplement it with contractors where required. So the payroll system is the most risky system, and currently we have a plan with state employees and staff augmentation contractors to address it in the next couple of years. We are extremely hopeful that we can start the ERP program and implement it in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar. Yes, Representative Nadon.
Yes, I've got one quick question. I think maybe you'll be able to help me. It says that, is this mic on? Yeah.
Yes.
It says there's 900 eligible employees that could possibly retire. I mean, I'd imagine not all of them are going to retire. Do you have a percentage that you anticipate would retire? Would 50% take that retirement, or you have no idea?
I think I can handle that question, if you will. I get a report on a weekly basis on the VRI. There were 901 employees eligible to retire under the VRI, and the program runs through the 15th, so there's 3 more days to go, but these numbers really haven't moved much in the last several weeks. So far, 293 have taken advantage of that, so there will be approximately 1/3 of the total amount of folks who were eligible. Where they are mostly leaving from is from DHS and URI, strangely enough, but that's not what I would have expected. So far, 40 people have signed up from DHS, 30 from URI. So and the rest are sprinkled among different agencies, and most of the biggest numbers come from some of the biggest agencies. But so between DHS at 40 and URI at 30, everyone else is less than 30, and most are in the many are in the single digits.
Thank you. So that was the expected savings. Is that what you had expected?
Well, the expected savings come from rotating folks out who have longevity pay as part of their package, and replacing them with, in this case, to the extent that some of these folks are the older, more senior folks, they'll be replaced by younger people who will either be at a lower step or not have the longevity pay, and there'll be a savings realized from that. This also provides some upward mobility and opportunity for folks who have been working with the state for a number of years, but because of a lack of mobility, haven't had an opportunity to really operate at a higher level. So this will give them an opportunity to do that, and we are backfilling at entry level and intermediate levels, but. So this represents a significant turnover, yes, but many of these departments are stocked with people who have experience and are looking for an opportunity to advance. So we're fortunate. Now, I'm not going to deny that there are other instances where there are folks that are going to leave a hole. That's certainly the case, and we will miss some of those folks. But we are aggressively recruiting out there to fill these slots. One example of structurally what we're doing is Dottie Pascal, who is head of the Pandemic Recovery Office, is actually being vested under Peter Keenan in the Accounts and Control Office, because that's where responsibility for grants management vests. So I think that between the staff that is already existing there and with Dottie's experience in audit, that really is a strengthening, that will really serve to strengthen accounts and control going forward as we head into the ERP system that BJ and Joe talked about.
Okay, thank you.
No, you go right ahead.
I've got one more question. It's unrelated to that. The LIUNA settlement, the statewide LIUNA settlement, you have a recommended budget of $4.3 million in general revenues, and I believe this is just an estimate. Did you shoot high with that estimate to make the settlement, or do you feel as though you're going to be right on cue with this?
This is very sensitive because it's imminent. I think that a settlement could be arrived at within the next several days. So it's a very delicate situation to talk about exact numbers, but I think that this was a number that both budget and HR felt comfortable with. And as we work through the negotiations, it seems to be very much within range. I really don't want to talk any more about it because it's
Okay, thank you. And
a very sensitive time.
all right, and one more question, and this is unrelated as well to the last question. The Volkswagen, agreement where you settled for the Air Act violations for $18.5 million. Some $4.1 million of the funds went to the Attorney General, and $14.4 million went to the DEM. Who was responsible for distributing those funds? How did they? Was there an independent body? In other words, how'd they end up with the DEM and the Attorney General's office?
I don't have the answer to this question.
That would be, I believe, on page 25, slide 50.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna need to get back to you on the terms of the settlement on that one and how it was distributed.
All right, thanks.
Sorry.
Director, I believe that's going to cover all of the questions that the committee has for you this evening. Did you have anything, or did any of your division heads have anything that you wanted to add that was not covered in the presentation by fiscal staff?
I don't think so. Joe, do you have anything that you'd like to add, or?
No, thank you. Thank you, committee. It's been a pleasure. And we'll gladly follow up on some of your other follow-up questions.
All right, thank you. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to turn our attention to the Department of Revenue now. Representative Nadon, did you have any questions? Not yet? Okay, that's fine. For the Is the acting director? Yes, I see that she's here. Director, I'd like to speak to you with regards to what's on slide 19 in our package, which is the 4.0 new FTE for adult use marijuana taxes. And I'm curious if that's specifically for the medical cannabis, or is this what you're anticipating for in the event that we do have adult use cannabis as passed into law?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the appropriate person who's on who can answer that for you is the tax administrator, Nina Savage.
Okay.
Nina?
Thank you, Marilyn. Hello, Rep. Vela-Wilkinson. That is for recreational marijuana, and it's for 2 tax investigators, part of our special investigations unit, which would do the actual field investigations as they do with tobacco and cigarettes, and also for 2 revenue agents to handle the billing and the reconciling collection and remittance issues.
So then, Nina, the 4 new FTEs would not come into effect unless and until adult use cannabis is passed in the House and Senate, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And right now, I believe the budget article has a January 1 effective date. However, we would need to hire those employees to start developing the protocols, the forms, and the processes, and potentially regulations related to that activity.
All right, excellent, thank you. I'd like to move to the DMV. And is Mr. Craddock still on with us?
I am here.
Oh,
I
awesome.
am here, Madam Chair.
Excellent. So I'm looking at what is on slide 27 for the presentation that was put before the committee. And my question has to do with the Warren location and the Westerly location. So the Warren location was closed and the lease was not renewed, but Rhode Island general laws requires the site. So I'd like to know what the status is of the new site and also the relocation of the Westerly site, which is only open on Fridays.
Sure. Both leases were terminated by the municipalities, Warren and Westerly. Because of COVID, we have not gone out to seek an alternate site in Warren. We have entered negotiations with the town of Westerly. We will potentially reopen in their police station. But right now, we do have concerns until some of the restrictions that are in place for COVID are eased, because we do have some concerns with the ability to keep people socially distanced in that location. As soon as we do have the opportunity, we have funding available to reopen Westerly in that building. And then once we do get some relaxation of the regulations, we will go out and seek a location in Warren. One of the concerns is we have to be in a town building. To be open only 2 days a week, it isn't fiscally sound to be renting a standalone location and only opening it 2 days a week. So we'll be talking to the town administrators to try to find a location. Hopefully they will be able to find something for us.
Mr. Craddock, is the online reservation system working to your satisfaction?
Quite frankly, we are very impressed with it. We have had an overwhelming support from our constituents. People love it. We have taken our pre-COVID wait times, which were about 70 minutes. Right now, our average wait time is about 12 to 14 minutes. So people are in and out of the DMV locations usually 20 to 25 minutes at most. That includes their actual transaction time. One of the issues that we have had and we're faced with, and it's frustrating from our standpoint, is the amount of people that are making reservations and then don't show up. We have anywhere up to a 30% no-show rate on a given day. We do try to overbook to try to account for that. But one of the issues we find is that with this particular reservation system that we had, and it was the one we used when we implemented our RIM system about 3 years ago, it's a very limited system. We're glad we had it. We were able to dust it off right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're able to keep our operations going. I'm sure you may have seen one of the handouts that we've passed, but the entire DMV was only closed one day through the entire pandemic. So we were able to provide our services using the system. However, it does have shortfalls, and we are in the process of building a new one that is going to be integrated with our RIM system. That's going to give us better metrics and better control of the operations of the reservation system. And we hope through the course of that, as we're building that out, that we'll be able to send follow-up emails or SMS messages as reminders to the individuals, so that we hope that will cut down on the no-show rate.
All right, thank you very much. Is Paul Grimaldi still with us? No. Ms. Savage, if I could ask.
Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
Oh, all right, great.
Madam
Paul,
Chairwoman,
I have a
how
question.
can I help you?
I have a question with regards to the impact of COVID on the third-party hosting system and the revenue that we were getting from the taxation from the Airbnbs and such. Have we seen a marked decline in that as well?
I'm not sure I really want to answer that. Are you asking whether the revenue from third-party hosting systems is going down?
The taxation that we get from the third-party hosting systems.
I think I can cover that.
Yeah,
Is this Nina?
exactly. Go ahead, Nina.
Go ahead, Nina. Sorry about that.
No problem. I'll be presenting this at the May Revenue Estimating Conference, and year over year, we have revenues went up by about $100,000. They were at about 4.087 million in FY20, and FY21 they're almost 4.2 million. So I don't know if Office of Revenue Analysis has anything to add to that, and I know Paul Dion is also on. So what we reported in May is that it did not decline.
Okay. And then we still have some of the units that are paying directly to the state and others that are going through the municipalities. Is that correct? Or has that been taken care of?
We collect the state and local hotel tax. I don't believe any of the state or local hotel tax is collected at the municipal level. And there's a statutory prohibition against municipalities limiting that in any way. I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'd be happy to look into it.
The Airbnbs, it's my understanding that some of the patrons from the Airbnbs are providing the tax for the room to the host, and then the host is either sending it to the municipality or to the state.
Right, Newport is the only municipality that collects its own state and local hotel tax. But yes, there are hosting platforms, realtors, property managers that collectively submit that tax to us so that we can distribute according to the local hotel tax to where the property is rented, and to the tourism bureau based on the calculations of the state hotel tax.
Okay, thank you. And the last question that I have has to do with the pilot. Who should I direct that question to? Payment
The centralized collection unit.
for the payment in lieu of taxes. I'm looking now at slide 42, local aid, general aid programs.
Steve?
Yes, Madam Chairman.
Yeah.
I can help you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
How can I help?
Okay, so I see that there is a change of 1.8 million on the pilot program, and I was wondering, how is that going to be distributed, please? that reduction.
Are you referring to the difference between what it would be fully funded at if it was at the full 27%? Because on that slide, I'm looking at slide 44 right now. It shows the law allows up to 27%, and it shows 1.8 million less than full funding. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm actually on slide 42, where it shows that the pilot was enacted at 50.7, and then fiscal year 22, it goes to 46.1, and the current law full funding is 47.9.
Yes, so that's the difference between full funding, but the law allows up to 27%. It's currently funded for 22 at 26. So the difference between those two is that 1.8, which is not distributed to the municipalities.
I see it. All right. So I understand. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative Nadon, go ahead, please.
Okay, I don't know who to address this question, but it has to do with capital projects. And I'm on page 30, slide 60, and there's 187.5 million to be used between fiscal year 2022 to 2026 on projects on the Eleanor Slater Hospital, Convention Center, the Dunkin' Donuts Center, the Shepherd Building, and the Capitol Hill Center. Are this money, is it allocated for things the buildings need, or is it just to update them and give them a better look, or is it these buildings in actual need of like a roof or windows? Because it says that, the past campus projects, it looks like they're in need. They need a roof, they need window replacements and utility upgrades. But down below that, I was just wondering, these other buildings, if they actually have a need for that capital infrastructure money.
Joe, do you want me to take this, or do you want it?
Sure, Director, you can go ahead and I'll fill in if I need to.
Okay, so Representative Nadon, you should know that that DCAM does a facilities needs assessment on an annual basis and updates both maintenance and capital needs statewide. And that is incorporated into an annual updated plan of the capital budget, which process we just kicked off earlier this week for next year already. And basically those capital needs are prioritized to account for the fact that there are many more needs than we can actually fund. So to the extent that there are projects that are being slated for actual funding or financing, these are very definitely only the most critical needs that the state can fund.
Thank you.
Here we go. All right. I did have a couple of questions with regards to Eleanor Slater Hospital and Zambrano, but I'm going to hold that for when we have the hearing specifically for those two entities instead of asking for a preview tonight. So I'm checking my board to make sure that none of my colleagues that are calling in or watching from home have any questions, and I see no one has raised their hand. And if you're satisfied, Representative Nadon, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank both the Department of Administration and the Department of Revenue for their attention this evening. and for answering all of our questions. And I also, did we have a phone call?
He bailed out earlier today.
So we had a phone call, and apparently he was satisfied with the presentations and his question was answered. So that's always a good sign. And as always, I would like to thank the House fiscal staff for all of the hard work that they put in before and during these hearings. The committee is now adjourned. Thank you very much.